Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bill Brannon, Hudson Director of the Digital Research and Curation Center at Johns Hopkins University, as well as the Open Source Programs Office, or OSPO. If you're not familiar with the OSPO acronym, you'll be hearing it a lot as part of this session. So I'll be kicking off by discussing the work of OSPOs at academic institutions, and the rest of my colleagues will be jumping in with other ways that OSPOs support open source work in collaboration across institutions and across a lot of other groups that are working in the open source space. So in April of last year, I had the opportunity to present at CNI in Denver a panel talking about early lessons learned from university OSPOs with some colleagues from Carnegie Mellon, UC Santa Cruz, and University of Vermont. And the reason I bring this up is because at the time, that panel represented 4 out of 6 of university OSPOs that existed or were known at the time. Today, a year and a half later, this panel represents 5 institutions out of a group of 20. And that number is still growing. So in a year and a half, we've seen some tremendous growth in the recognition of the need for the work that OSPOs are doing, and a lot of interest in what an OSPO can do in terms of allowing open source to really be supported and managed well within the academic institutions that are moving in that direction. As more academic OSPOs have been created, we've seen an increased level of coordination and collaboration as well. So I'll be speaking today about the institutional OSPOs at one academic institution, and then my colleagues will be speaking about statewide and consortial networks, as well as global networks. So at Johns Hopkins, we created our OSPO in 2019 in the Sheridan Libraries. The benefit of sitting in the libraries is that it allows the OSPO to benefit from the reputation as a central resource, a neutral party, and a place where everyone is welcome. The library is also involved in a wide variety of open initiatives, so open access, open data, all the things that we've been talking about here at this conference. So adding open source to that mix made a great deal of sense. The OSPO currently has 1 full-time dedicated staff member, our program manager, Megan Forbes, but it's also co-located with the Digital Research and Curation Center, which is a software and systems engineering development team that is serving the libraries. And as I oversee both groups, I'm able to apply technical resources into the OSPO needs to meet strategic objectives as well, which turns out to be quite helpful. While the OSPO at Hopkins is in the libraries, there are a lot of different places where institutional OSPOs sit. You can see from this list that they're quite varied. And we have folks that are in the CURIOSS group, which is a network of academic OSPOs that you'll hear more about shortly, that not only sit in each one of these places, but some span across these different parts of the institution. And each organizational structure for an OSPO brings with it a set of benefits and sometimes drawbacks in terms of what's possible and the level of coordination or collaboration that you're able to do because of where that place sits. And I think it's part of the experimental nature of OSPOs at the moment that we're seeing these sit in different places in order to allow for some understanding of whether the values of putting an OSPO in the library and in other places. A major advantage of OSPO work at the institutional level is the ability to explore and experiment. If you're familiar with the lean startup or agile processes, you'll know about the build, measure, and learn cycle. The purpose of this process is to start very small, create minimum viable product or MVP, and put that in front of people, measure how they use it, learn what works and what doesn't. This allows you to understand what's working and to fail fast when things don't work. We've taken a similar approach, though we tweaked it just a little bit to start with the learn step. We felt like it was really necessary to understand what was going on first. So we began by learning about the open source communities on campus, who's doing what, discovering the projects that we're working on, discovering what collaboration approaches they were using, and understanding the common challenges or roadblocks that they were facing. Then we started building resources tailored to meet the needs of these groups. And as we understood more, then we were able to build better resources. We would then measure how those resources were used or not, and what the impact was, listen to feedback, then iterated on the process to improve the outcomes and move forward in a way where we better understood what the needs were. So I'm going to talk about two different examples of how the JHU OSPO is using this process to support campus open source communities. The first is the Free and Open Source Software Project Fund, or FOSPROF. This was generously funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and its purpose was to understand the specific, immediate, tangible needs of open source projects. What's holding them up? Where are the blockers? What will allow them to progress faster and more effectively? This was a small step, an initial step, an MVP, with a short submission timeline over November and December of last year, so you know how hard it is to get things done around the holidays. We were still happy to see that despite these constraints, we had 15 total project submissions, and we're able to fund 9 of them out of that group, with budgets ranging all the way from $4,000 to $50,000, so it was a broad range. The selection criteria for these projects is there a well-defined problem statement? Do they understand what they're planning to take on? Are there clear, measurable, and achievable goals? They only had 6 months to execute, so they needed to be able to jump in and move quickly. Do the PIs have the necessary skills and experience to complete the work, or have plans to bring on others with those skills? Does the budget align with the project scope? What is the plan beyond the funding period? What's sustainability, and how would that work? And what is the expected impact? What's not on the slide, but what's also very important, are what's not included in the selection criteria. These projects weren't required to create something new. Some did this, but we also encouraged reuse, expansion, and contribution to existing open source projects. In many scenarios, building something new really isn't the best solution. The projects also did not need to be novel or groundbreaking. Oftentimes, the most needed work in open source project is not glamorous. Refactoring, security improvements, performance, modularization, containerization, cloud deployment, these are all examples of work that was done in these projects, and there's a recognition that very often those things are hard to fund or hard to get done, hard to complete in a funding model. So this chart shows the percentage of FOSPROF proposals per school at JHU, per academic division. So the submissions came from 6 out of our 10 academic divisions, and the largest percentage was from the School of Arts and Sciences, which was a surprise to us. The major takeaway, I think, of this is that even in our small subset, we're able to see very easily that open source work is not just happening in the engineering school or the usual places you might expect, but it's really happening all over campus. And the FOSPOF projects represent a wide range of disciplines, from economics, reproducibility, to experimental music scores, to scalable rodent task tracking. All kinds of things that really interesting projects that you don't always associate with open source work. Another example is our open source project catalog. This is a catalog that captures open source projects created at JHU and those directly supported by JHU. So that's either through code contributions, resourcing, leadership, or by other means. The catalog highlights the work of these project teams. It also provides projects with a default project page if they don't have their own, and a link that can be used in papers or in presentations to get people back to the resources of their project. The catalog is also a place for discovery projects within a discipline, a discovery of collaborators, and to find examples of good open source practice. If you're looking to understand how work is being done in open source at an institution, it's helpful to have some examples to pay attention to. It's also useful for the OSPO in terms of communication in order to notify these groups when funding is available or there are other opportunities for collaboration and communication or additional options for working together. So I've highlighted a couple of examples from the JHU OSPO around the work that we're doing. There's a lot of work that are happening across OSPOs at a lot of the institutions that are that are engaged with open source work. The CURIOSS group has developed a categorized list of activities, and the categories are listed here. There are 50 to 60 different items within that list, and all of them have multiple institutions that are doing some of that work. Some examples that might fall into these categories are things like consulting on licensing, community development, governance, sustainability, hosting or supporting events like the FOSPROF Summit event, hackathons, project meetings, awards or prizes for open source work, facilitating discussions around open source. For example, in the past few weeks, we've convened discussions around institutional use of Anaconda and Hugging Face and GitHub Copilot, among other things. There are many things an OSPO can do. Certainly, it requires a considerable review at each institution to consider the points of focus that are most valuable and most helpful in the unique institutional environment. But this is really the value that the institutional level OSPO can bring, a deep focus on the specific needs of the campus and the work that's happening there, and the opportunities to learn from that specific cohort of work and figure out how to do the best job of facilitating that and providing support for it. But of course, some work requires broader consensus and benefits from collaborative effort. And to begin that discussion, I'll pass the podium to Todd.
Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. Thanks for that introduction to OSPOs. I'm going to talk a little bit about a new sort of way to do open source program offices. About a couple of years ago, the Sloan Foundation put out a call for people to apply for grants to start an OSPO on a campus. About 5 of the UCs got together and we wrote a application, a letter of interest, and Sloan came back and said, well, you guys should do one for the system. Go back and try again. So we got together, a group of us, to start a multi-campus OSPO. About 5 campuses got together. UC Davis, UC Santa Cruz, UC San Diego, UCLA, and did I say Santa Cruz? Berkeley. Yeah. And we all got together and we wrote a grant, and they said, well, you guys do one for the system. So that's what we got together to do. Multi-campus OSPO, we've clustered ourselves in a couple of ways around some collaborative themes. You can see them on the slides. Discovery. This is about finding software that's written in the University of California. And about a year ago, I did a campus-wide research data review for our campus. And I talked to, I don't know, a few hundred PIs, deans, associate deans for research. I came to realize just how much software was being written at UCLA. And when this opportunity came up, I thought, well, this is a great opportunity for us to actually reach out to campus and provide sort of a lens on library services to a lot of faculty members who don't necessarily see us as being sort of central to the work they do, because they're just, heads down writing software. And I think Amber's going to talk a little bit about the discovery piece, but it's really been, I think, pretty eye-opening. We've got a theme focused on sustainability, so this is really in and around making sure that the software that does get written on our campuses is seen and supported. And then there's an education theme, which is really centered at UCLA. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. We have sort of invented kind of a governance structure for this in the UC. We've got this thing called a leadership group where we have PIs from each campus that we sort of get together fairly regularly and talk about what's going on in the projects. We have a big focus on outreach and community on all of our campuses. And I think the feedback has been really wonderful for us. We're doing a bit of dog fooding, I guess, because we're doing our project management in GitHub, which is all about open source software. Right. So these are our campuses that each have a role in these different thematic areas. I'm going to talk a little bit about the education piece, because that's my piece. We're doing that at UCLA. We've got a data science center in the library, and we're very focused on carpentry's education. So what we're doing is, I wish I could have my glasses on. We've got a couple of our campuses working together in and around the education theme. Right now, what we're doing is we're sort of taking an inventory of what's available in terms of open source educational components, what carpentry's lessons are available, what other lessons are available, just trying to get sort of a real understanding of kind of where support is in terms of education. We're going to do a little bit of benchmarking to figure out what we want to do to support this initiative and across the campuses, and then we're going to start identifying and filling in gaps in what we notice in terms of educational support. And we'll be developing some carpentry's lessons, and then you all can learn from us. We're going to be implementing and doing some continuous improvement. And again, this is a multi-campus focus. So we've got folks who from across the system who are working on this with us. And I'm happy to answer questions at the end. So next.
Hi, I'm Amber Budden, UC Santa Barbara, and as Todd said, I'll be talking about the discovery component of the work that we're doing as part of the UC network. And although you'll see the UCSB logo on the next set of slides, this really is a collaboration across the full group, with the main participants being Santa Cruz, Davis, and Santa Barbara. So unlike Todd, I had not previously done a full evaluation and lengthy conversations with 200 or so PIs across the campus. But when this opportunity came up to explore having an OSPO or being part of the OSPO network, one of the first things that I did was reach out to people and say, do we have a catalog of open source? Like, do we know what the open source is on our campus? And the answer was no. In talking to other institutions, it seemed to be the same challenge that exists at other institutions. And so that was part of the motivation for the discovery piece. Like baseline, we want to understand the landscape. We want to understand the contribution of the UC-wide network to the open source community. And we want to be able to understand and support the individuals that are engaged in this. So we had a kind of a people, product, practice, perception approach. We were interested in the people that were engaged in open source. We were interested in the products that they were developing, but we also wanted to know how they were doing this and the perceptions around open source, the challenges they had. And that last piece was really to help inform what we could offer them as an OSPO. So some of this work had already been started by Mike Roshinsky at University of Texas, Austin, and we have been collaborating with Jonathan Starr at NumFocus, who has taken a similar approach, which is essentially to scrape GitHub. And so what he is doing in the repo finder is he has the ability to search GitHub repositories, to analyze those repositories for the content, to collate information about the contributors and provide metrics and analyses around the contributors to those repos, to provide some categorization of the repositories. GitHub can be used for lots of different things, building websites, doing project management, a collation of teaching resources, as well as open source software. And all of this work that's done can then be exported as JSON files or CV outputs. And so this is one approach to discovery that we have, which is to scrape GitHub. So we're in the process of developing the query right now for this. And you can see here an example query. Essentially, we're looking at all derivations of UC Santa Barbara, University of California, Santa Barbara, UCSB, UC Santa Barbara, et cetera, to try and identify repositories with affiliations to the university. And we're doing that for all of the 6 campuses that Todd mentioned. The output there, I don't expect you to read the details. I'll give you the link to the repository in a moment, but that's just showing all of the different fields that we get from this query. And as I mentioned, we're going through a process of iteration right now on this. So here's where you can write things down or take a picture. This is the link to the repository that Jonathan Starr has developed that has all of the code for this repo finder. We're interested in open source, and of course it is open source. And this table shows all of the different fields associated with it. So as I mentioned, this is a process of iteration. Initially, we included, as well as the university name as part of the query, also known research units or groups within the institution to see whether we could find additional results that way. What we found is that some of those institutional departments or groups, the names are actually not unique to the institution, and so we would get a lot of false positives. And I say that as a caveat to the next slide. So this is showing the number of repositories that have been pulled from GitHub for each of those institutions. This number is in flux as we refine the query. I just want to make it very, very clear. As I mentioned, not all of this is going to be open source software, and there may be some false positives in here, and trying to find that balance between recall and accuracy without having to do a lot of manual data correction is what we're striving for. And so we are in a process of iteration, but it gives you a sense of the extent of open source that's coming out of the UC. And of course, this is just GitHub. And as we know, engineers, developers work in different environments as well, not all in GitHub. Now, the goal of this work is to be able to create a dashboard, which we are calling the open source repository browser. And another caveat, do not try and enter that URL that you see there because it won't take you anywhere. This is a PowerPoint mockup. This is not a platform. So essentially, this is what we're striving to get towards. This is a mockup of what we would like to see. This is probably, after a beta or two along the way, this will not be our first attempt. But what we're trying to do is have the capability to have a database backend, faceted search, so that individuals, perhaps your administrators who are interested in looking at the open source that's coming out of your community, be able to take a look at the open source that exists, get some key metrics on that. But then also on the right-hand side, integrate the work that Jonathan Starr has been doing with the map of open source software at NumFocus to be able to have that kind of relational network analysis to understand the people and the connections between the people. So that's what's coming out of the GitHub work. And that really focuses on the people and the products. As I mentioned, we're also interested in practice and perception. And so to be able to evaluate this, we're going to be conducting a survey. We're in the process of developing a survey instrument that will be administered across the 6 campuses and potentially the other 4 if they have the capacity to administer it. And there are 2 primary objectives for this. One of them is to discover open source on campus, as I mentioned, the people and the products. It will enable us to validate the information that we're getting from the GitHub scrape. It will also augment with open source products that aren't in the GitHub ecosystem, and it will facilitate community building within the UC open source software community. So that enables us to discover it, but as I said, we're interested in how people are working and the perceptions around open source. We'll be able to evaluate challenges and opportunities within UC open source, and that's going to really inform the development of the OSPO network services that we provide for individuals. So University of Madison also have a survey that is around open source. That one is largely focused on perceptions around open source and use of open source. This one is much more focused on the maintainers and the contributors. We're interested in the people that are engaging in development of open source. And so it's going to be a complementary survey to the one that has been produced already by Madison. And just like theirs, we will make all of our code results and information openly accessible to everybody. And with that, I think we're going to transition to sustainability.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Vesela Ensberg from the UC Davis Library. I'm going to echo my co-panelists in that even though I am presenting from the UC Davis Library, this sustainability theme is meant to be a cross-network collaboration, and the main contributors here are UC Davis and UC Santa Barbara. There are several projects that we are trying out within this theme. One of them is containerization pilot. So what we would like to do is take some publications that have open source tools published alongside with the work, but may not have a community established yet. And we would like to experiment with containerizing those tools in order to provide some buffer time for the creators of the software to build out this contribution network to allow it to prosper further. Vladimir Filkov, one of the UC Davis co-PIs, has previously developed a tool that is assessing graduation of open source projects within the Apache Foundation. His group is now taking this tool and developing it further so that it predicts sustainability, reaching sustainability of the project in a foundation agnostic manner, and combining that with recommendations on how to get to that sustainability in a faster way. He is basing that on an analysis of both the development contributions to a particular repository and the communications that are going in between the participants in that project. A third contribution that we're doing towards sustainability is collecting open source software practices, best practices, and we're doing that through white papers and contributing MD files from different foundations and different well-established projects, and we're bringing them together in both a Zotero library and Notebook LM. Some of you may have attended the previous presentation that talked about how that's a tool that can bring together these documents and then you can interrogate them. What's of particular interest to me is allowing our users to ask about where do these best practices agree and what things they disagree on. So this is still very much in testing in terms of the accuracy of the answers, but that's the idea behind using yet that tool. We also hired a community manager that is working across the entire network because building a community is the way to sustain an open source software project. So she's drawing from the discovery theme, different types of projects and contributors to contact and to form communities of practice. She will be working both within a particular campus to bring people together so that it's easier to troubleshoot in proximity, but also very much looking across the different campuses to bring people together based on fields, subject expertise, or particular types of languages. And this is a really interesting situation where we're thinking about it. The reason why we went into this as a network is understanding that open source transcends a campus. And so then really the question is, well, it probably transcends the network too, right? So where does that leave us? Which activities belong on a campus? Which activities belong in a network or a larger organization? And you're going to hear more about CURIOSS in a moment. And how do we interact with foundations? And at what point do we recommend that our contributors also connect with a foundation? So we try to organize these thoughts into a table like this, where our thoughts on what belongs on a campus are sort of more contained experimentations, such as pilot projects that require cost control. If there are particular strengths of a university in a certain discipline, that might be also a reason to keep a particular activity on campus. Also, it's very, very important for all of us to build relationships and build trust. And so being able to quickly respond to your constituents to whom you're already, with whom who you're already serving as part of your job is also very helpful if you're on the same campus. For inter-campus activities, things like the discovery methodology that we're sharing is a particularly useful case. And in general, any methodology that is developed within these offices would be applicable across campuses. And community building is very much a cross-campus effort, as well as the best practices that fuel these projects and their path to sustainability. And you will now hear more about sort of the growing network of these OSPOs into something national and international.
Good afternoon. I'm David Lippert. About a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, I did a career change into academia, and now I'm the director of the George Washington University Open Source Program Office. I love my new job. One of the things, I am indebted to the CURIOSS network because I was so ignorant about academia and libraries, and they have guided me. There's so many experts that have really helped me understand the ins and outs and made me way more productive than I had any reasonable expectation to have. One thing I just learned last month that I can't get out of my mind is the idea of continuous open science. This, I think, is come together with the idea of open source software has a nice agile, continuous move. You do a release and then you update it and you have a next release. And science has this more long-term, less dynamic way of working. And I'm excited that OSPOs are a place where we can experiment and see if we can move towards a more continuous version of science following some of those agile software ideas and see where we can implement them and not. But generally, we're following, really living by all of the ethos of open science and open access, open data, open source software. I think all of the OSPOs are really focusing on that. And it aligns so nicely with the libraries where my OSPO happens to sit. Another thing I'm really excited about is the global community that we have. I think we can, something that CURIOSS is enabling is deduping the work. I've seen it firsthand. We're sharing knowledge. Our cadence is really just bi-weekly meetings and then a Slack group, and then all of these conversations start happening. We have every 6 months we have a conference as well, and everybody's invited, and we have a lot of fun. And then amplifying messaging, I think, is something I'm really excited about the potential of. There's a lot of collective action problems, and I think if our universities start to work together and identify solutions, do prototypes, we might be able to implement some solutions that could be, yeah. So CURIOSS itself is primarily US and Europe based. We are looking for new members right now. I think we have an open enrollment period that was just extended for another week. So if you're interested in joining, please let us know. There's a slide at the end that'll have some details about that. From CURIOSS, there's a whole bunch of other international collaborations that have been spawned. One was Saeed had a talk earlier about the Open Forum for AI, and he invited all of the CURIOSS members and George Washington and University of Texas, Austin, and Georgia Tech, along with Carnegie Mellon, all joined that effort. And that's a really exciting collaboration that we're doing. And then the United Nations had a conference, I think 2 years ago they had 50 members, and then last year they had 600 members. They invited all OSPOs. It's called OSPOs for Good. And so all of the academic OSPOs were invited there, and there were a lot of really interesting collaborations and networking that happened there. One of those is a working group. If you ever ask a question on Slack, they've joined a Slack, they formed a Slack group for the conference, and then I sillily asked a question, and then now I'm leading a working group to answer that question. This is part of my ignorance of academia, and now I know. But CHAOSS is hosting this working group, and we're going to try to identify how open source software is impacting or addressing the various UN Sustainable Development Goals. So really excited about this work. and the United Nations is involved, and my co-lead is in Nigeria, Ruth Akega. So we have some great participation, and several of the OSPOs are also joining that working group as well. CURIOSS itself is, we have several working groups. I hope I listed them all. I think we have 21 members right now. And again, we are open for new membership. Our working groups are AI, University OSPO operations, code review, governance, license tech transfer, and open source software curriculum. So yeah, we have a cadence of like bi-weekly working group meetings and have a lot of outputs that we're trying to generate from those. I'll talk about one of the outputs from the University OSPO operations group in a little bit more detail later. One thing that I really like about CURIOSS is this idea of patterns. We have all these things that we've talked about across our institutions, that same needs, the same things that we're sharing. And so we're not deduping that work. We're talking to each other and sharing the work. One example is the open source survey. I'm using the University of Wisconsin version, and I just ran it. I'm still running it. If you're from George Washington, please fill out their survey. Oh my gosh, survey fatigue is a real thing. I think I have to give full-size candy bars because small candy bars apparently don't work. University of Wisconsin cheated. They give out $2 bills to do their survey. So they got like 400 respondents, and I think I'm at like 100, and I'm nervous. I need more candy bars. The institutional innovation grapher, we started working that and are trying to map our what are the GW open source projects. That's a great tool, and working with Michael Shanksky is awesome. And Jonathan Starr is actually on our UN SDG working group, so he's doing amazing work as well. The project registry, we're following the model that other groups are doing. We've implemented a student award program that models what Stanford is doing. That one thing that they're doing that I really like is they're giving ORCID recognition for the award winners. So they're going to help me work through how to do that, because there's a little bit of bureaucracy. Another really exciting space is intern programs and getting interns and capstone projects to have students do real work on real open source projects. University of Vermont has open sourced their entire intern research program called ORCA, Open Research Community Accelerator. I love it. It's ORCA, and then they have teams of students with student leads and their pods, and I just want the whole thing. And and then the final thing is the academic OSPO definition. And I'll talk to this briefly. Jeffrey Young from Georgia Tech was the lead of this working group. Said and several others worked on this, and we just released our paper, our first draft, I think a month and a half ago. So we would love feedback from all of you, anybody who's interested. It's on Zenodo. It's called A Definition of an Academic OSPO. And basically, there's 4 sections to this. It's what is an academic OSPO. We define it pretty clearly, trying to scope it out. There's the executive summary, which is to sell to your leadership. The one page. Why would your leadership care, and why would they want to fund it or make space for it? What does an academic OSPO do is the meat of this. And Bill mentioned he had a slide with the list of all of the specifics, but it's developing and sharing best practices, educational efforts, working with tech transfer and external partners, tools and infrastructure, supporting OSS, community building, supporting the creation of new OSS by the academic community, advocacy and policy, and funding and financial support. And it's sort of a mix and match. Like every OSPO doesn't have to do all of these things. Depending on where you're positioned or what you're doing, you can pick and choose what makes sense for your organization, and then how well you're resourced. Our OSPO, I'm full-time, and we have 1 half-time, and I feel like that's a lot. Plus our library just has already been doing a lot of open source work beforehand. So I know that like open source will still exist even if our OSPO goes away. And we're also Sloan funded. We're in the 2nd year of our initial grant, and then we're expecting to get a follow-on grant, and then for 2 more years, and then after that, it's like you're on your own. So we have to figure it out. And then the last piece is how to set up an academic OSPO. And there was an initial paper done by OSPO++, and Saeed, I think, primarily wrote it. And it was like my blanket that I used to just figure out my way as I was starting the OSPO. It's really valuable, and we kept a lot of that information. So this is how to become a member, more information about our various networks, and then just open it up for questions. Thank you very much.
Hi, it's me in Cornell University, and I guess this is a question for Bill first, partly because he said it first, but everyone kind of continued with the theme. You said in your learn phase you wanted to learn about the open source community on your campus, and I hazard a guess that there wasn't much of a community per se. There were lots of pockets, which is what I would imagine at my institution. So the question is that what you found? And then secondarily, as you've worked on your OSPO, do you think you've found a meaningful community, or do you think it will mostly be a sort of hub and spoke model? Thank you.
Yes, certainly there are a lot of disparate parts to what we're calling the open source community within the Hopkins environment. There's a lot of projects and labs that are really doing their own work, and they're focused on that. Sometimes they're working with other institutions. Sometimes they're working with others outside of the academic environment, even with the corporate sponsors. So there's a lot there, but finding what they're doing and who is doing what has been a really interesting challenge, because there's not a playbook for this. We're kind of developing one. That's the purpose of the guide that David talked about. But that it's a continuing process, and it really starts by understanding who do we know, and touching base there, and then just really continuing, and the more opportunities that we can provide for people to come talk to us instead of us having to find them, that's really helpful. One example is the OSPO at Hopkins runs the GitHub enterprise environment for the institution, and so anyone who wants to use GitHub within that environment comes to us to talk about that, and then we're able to talk about the work that they're doing. So I think there's a lot of discovery work that has to happen to understand what it is that's really happening on campus, and we keep discovering new things. Like, we're constantly hearing from groups like, oh, you're doing something we hadn't heard about yet. So and I'll let others on the panel discuss their experiences as well.
Yeah, I'll just throw in a couple of thoughts. Really, campuses. I found campus very ready for this conversation. To be frank, we have talked about open access on our campus throughout the system for years. Open science is a big deal on my campus. I'm sure it's the same. Open data is something we've also been pushing, and so I feel like the message is not a hard one to sell to campus. They are interested in sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, open source. And I feel like it's really a good role for the library to be out there educating people about what open source is, what those licenses look like, and how to use them.
So we're developing a survey. So we don't have the level of depth of information that has previously been expressed, but in the process of working towards collaborating on this award, on this grant, we brought together individuals from across campus to form a working group, and that's kind of the basis of our campus community right now. And so partnerships with faculty and with the Office of Research and with Campus IT are our path forward, and I think are critical to this, because there is a very distributed model of where open source development is occurring. We talked about the possibility of being able to look at proposals to see where open source is mentioned, and so our Office of Research has eyes into that, whether that's one way to be able to kind of identify and connect with the campus community. And also, some of us were recently at a UC technology conference, and there was a reminder from a question in the audience: like, don't forget staff. It's not just faculty and researchers. Remember the IT staff that are working in this space as well, and the contributions that they make to open source. So yeah, we were still in the discovery phase.
Yes, but partially that's why the community manager is going to be working on campus and across the campuses, because the idea is that she'll be able to identify connecting themes and bring people together from these pockets that you mentioned.
For our OSPO, I think we have two major missions. One is educational, to educate people how to make their research publicly available, and the other is community building. And there's a lot of work there. There's a lot of stovepipes and silos, and I find it very challenging to break through all those. We have created a stakeholder group with students, faculty, and staff that meets once every 2 months, and there's 40 members, and there is a ton of energy. Like, they're really excited. They're ready to go. We're going to have a conference, so there's a lot of work to do in that space. But I'm hoping that they can come up together and start to talk and realize there's a lot of commonality.
Thank you for the great presentation. You somewhat teed up where my question is heading, but I'm still curious, no pun intended, to hear more about how you connect with the IT personnel on campus, because as you alerted to, Amber, they're very well versed in open source software, and I imagine the campus is running a lot more open source software than they even care to acknowledge or even are aware of. And then also in the teaching and learning enterprise, have you connected with faculty who are maybe more committed to an open education framework and the way they can weave open education into their teaching and learning enterprise?
So in terms of our connection with campus IT, when we initiated this, at the library, I'm based at the library, we had conversations with the Chief Information Officer, with the Office of Research, and so they're very aware of the work that we are doing. Around the same time, Campus IT were in the process of developing a strategic plan for their group and for information technology at UCSB. And so open source software and research has penetrated that strategic plan. At UCSB, we don't actually have an OSPO. I think one of the benefits of the network that we didn't really touch upon is that we don't have an OSPO, but we're collaborating, and we have the ability to leverage the work, to contribute to and leverage the work that the network is doing without yet having our own OSPO. My goal is to be able to take this work that we're doing as part of the network to be able to justify establishment of an OSPO, and that would hopefully, my kind of vision, and my deputy UL is sitting over there, is that this will be a collaboration between Office of Research, CIO, and the library. And so having them as a partner would be the way in which we would engage with the IT professionals.
The first two emails I sent after we got the Sloan grant were to the CIO and to the tech transfer division on campus. They were both pretty excited about having this sort of initiative based at UCLA. And have been just so far great partners. We fill a role that I think the tech transfer folks really appreciate, and they have a tendency to push people to us. Your other question about the open education, we haven't really gotten that far yet. I think we're still building the network right now. I mean, I think, we're in the process of posting positions and hiring. We've got a couple of students at UCLA, undergraduate students working on it. So we're just getting, I think we're just getting started. So hopefully someday soon we'll have open educational resources. Thank you.
I'll just touch a little bit on the second part of your question. We have done some exploratory work in terms of the teaching and learning. We did have Stephen Wally from Microsoft teach a course at Hopkins, and now he's teaching courses at Carnegie Mellon around open source and how to work within a community. We're also looking at the small scale of teaching and learning and what do we need to start building up just some capacity and understanding around what it means to do open source work and how to build a community and how to sustain the work of an open source project. So it's very much a work in progress, and I think there's a lot more to be done there. And I think trying to get that work into the core curriculum, not just as a standalone course, but as part of the standard expectations for what an undergraduate or graduate student would learn as they're learning about what software is and understanding what open source software is and how that works. There's a lot of work to be done there, but I think we're moving in that direction.
I'll add one thing to the first part of your question. We're integrated very closely with IT because our dean is both the dean of the libraries and the dean of IT. So that's a unique, I think, fortuitous situation. But I also think we have a very strict, we are a services organization. So we have no mandates that anybody needs to use open source or has to use open source. It's very much, if you are using open source, come to us and we'll help you. And IT is using open source, Drupal, for example, for our website and things. So we're here to help. No mandates.
Also, to respond to the first part of the question, this tech conference that we presented at, it surfaced the staff who are interested to participate in this initiative. So we will be inviting them to our meetings to understand how better to support them in their efforts.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, thanks. Keith Webster from Carnegie Mellon. I might ask a two-parter as well, and you can duck the one you don't want. Firstly, I'd be interested to hear how your OSPOs on your campuses are becoming engaged in the conversations around open source AI and whether you're able to advance debate discussion. And secondly, I think you all have an institutional home in the university library, just as our OSPO does. And we certainly have made many of the institutional connections to which you've referred with computing services, the VP for research, tech transfer, and so on. But even how long have we been going? 2.5 years? Yeah, so 2.5 years on, I'm still struck by how many average faculty members, if there are such things, have no appreciation of the OSPO because they think the library is the big building full of books and don't come below that perception. So if you have any thoughts on how we get to the people who really could benefit from what we offer but haven't figured out the shift in our core business, I'd love to hear your tips there.
Yeah, I struggled with this. Recently, we've had a lot of discussions with our OVPR, especially with the Nelson memo coming down. Who knows if it's still going to happen? We're proceeding as though it will. And I think that is an impetus where all researchers and faculty need to understand that they're going to now have to make their data, all their research outputs. To me, that's data, software, and publications publicly available, and we're here to help. So that's sort of our line of thinking for that. It seems to be getting their attention.
So outreach is hard in general. I think with any kind of service that you're starting, I'm really counting on targeted outreach for this discovery of people who are involved in open source and we see could benefit from some additional support.
So UCSB, we have a couple of departments that are really focused on data and research data services and exploration, analysis, and visualization of data. And so we already have relationships built with faculty and researchers around their data challenges, which inevitably kind of starts to bring in code and software. And so we do provide some support already, although we don't have an OSPO. The conversations and the consultations kind of move into that space. And in addition, we have recently collaborated with a number of different units on campus to develop what we're calling the Research Computation and Data website or resource, because we recognize that different departments, different units, they have different computational services, but there's no kind of single catchment area for all of this information. And so the library has collaborated with, again, the Office of Research and with various departments to build out that resource. So we're doing a lot of outreach around that, and that's going to be the home for all of the OSPO-related services. And so we're already building a community, and we have monthly community calls around kind of research, computation, and data. And so it will be kind of an extension of that. And so I'm hoping that we're already kind of building in that outreach mechanism by having established this other service.
Okay. So what is open source AI? I mean, that's a really tough one, because I'm not sure they would fall into a classical definition of open source. But it's one of those things where people on our campus tend to be interested in, and they want to know more. And the licensing is confusing, and how to use the software, how to contribute. It's a really thorny question, and that's one of the reasons we do partner very closely with Tech Transfer, and we partner very closely with the CIO's office. It's one of those places where people, if they have questions, they wouldn't necessarily feel like the library is, the first spot to go and ask about, AI open source software. But being part of those communities and part of those conversations, we're all very much supported by our research offices. And so I typically try to do as much outreach to our Vice Chancellor for Research as I do for other deans on campus, because that's a voice when a Bruin post goes out. They're going to read Roger Wakamoto. They're not necessarily going to read something that I sent.
And I'd say that changing the perception of the library is a big problem, and it not just being books, but the more that we engage, I think the broader that community becomes, and we're starting to have some really interesting conversations. I think one example is one of the projects that we're involved in, the FOSPROF project group that I mentioned. One of the faculty there said, this grouping that was pulled together for that project as part of the OSPO's activities, like, this is the family I didn't realize I had. This is a working space for me to be able to consult with other people that I didn't realize I even had an opportunity to connect with. So certainly we still connect with people on a regular basis that come to us and say, I didn't know the OSPO existed. Tell me what you do. And so there's a continuing process of education to say, this is what we're doing. These are the resources we provide. These are the opportunities that we put in front of you. We want to hear your ideas. And I think there's a lot of value in that collaborative nature, that communication that's required in order to allow us to understand what the needs are that is causing them to reach out and discover that the OSPO exists. Just briefly on the AI front, I think that's a continuing conversation that I don't know that we have answers for at this point. Having the OSPO and the library is, I think, part of that conversation with campus and with all of the work that's happening. Like many of our institutions, Hopkins has made significant input into AI, and so making sure that the involvement of open source and the consideration of that is part of the conversation, I think is useful, and we'll see where it goes.
So we're at time, so I'll let everybody go, and I will come up and ask my question to the group. So,
thank you, everyone.
It's good.